And when Samuel got to Jesse's house, he said, "Jesse, do you have any sons?" And Jesse said, "Yes, I have lots of sons." And in fact, Jesse had 8 sons, 7 of whom were grown men, qualified soldiers, good prospects for being the king. And so we called them forward: Radai, Elihu, Eliab, Shammah, I almost forgot there, Abinadab, Ozem, and Nathanael, 7 strong sons. And Samuel said, "No, it's none of those. Do you have any others?" And of course then Jesse said, "Well, I have one other son, but he's just a child. He can't be the king." But of course Samuel said, "That's the one, bring him forward." And it was the little boy David, whom Samuel then anointed with olive oil and said, "The Spirit of God is upon you, and you shall be the king of all Israel." When we next see David, he has been called into the court of King Saul because David is a very skilled and beautiful musician and singer. And his music is able to calm down Saul when he's in a fit of rage. And so a good relationship starts between Saul and David. But then, of course, you know what happens. Israel is at war with Philistine, and the Philistines send out their champion Goliath. Goliath is a giant. He challenges the people. Nobody will fight him. David goes out and kills Goliath. And you need to know about that story that Saul was supposed to fight Goliath. Saul himself was a giant, 7 feet tall. He stood head and shoulders above any other man in Israel. But he was afraid. So the little boy David went out, and you remember that David went with 5 smooth stones from the river. People sometimes say, why did he take 5 stones when he only had to use 1? Did he lack confidence in his skill? And the answer is no. The reason that David took 5 stones is because Goliath had 4 bigger brothers. And David had every intention of going out into the field of battle and killing all 5 of those giants. We don't know the names of all of Goliath's brothers. We think that one was called Saph and one was called Ishbibanob. And I only say that because I love to say Ishbibanob. David was ready to fight all 5 of them. It looked like a good deal for Saul because somebody else did his fighting for him. But when David came back from battle, all the women in Israel began to sing, "Saul has slain his thousands, David has slain his tens of thousands." And all the people realized that day that David was the real king of Israel. And from that moment forward, Saul hated David. A deep, bitter hatred built on jealousy and insecurity. From that point onwards, if you read in 1 Samuel from chapter 18 onwards, Saul tries at least 7 times to kill David, and he fails each time. But after the 7th attempt, David realizes that he has to flee Jerusalem or else die. So he takes with him his 600 soldiers and flees down into the southeast. And of course, when Saul sees that, he's overjoyed because there's nothing there, only the desert. And he knows that David is going to die of thirst in the desert. Even if he makes it all the way over to the Dead Sea, it doesn't matter. There is no life there, and the water from the Dead Sea would only kill and embitter and break down. David is gone. Saul is happy. Until sometime later, he finds out that David has found a wellspring in the desert that will sustain him and his men. And when Saul hears that, he is enraged, and he gathers his 3,000 best soldiers, and he heads out into the desert to find En-gedi and to kill David there. He gets there. En-gedi, as an oasis, was quite a large area. There were hills and there were caves, lots of places to hide. And when they got there, Saul was tired. So he went into one of the caves, leaving his soldiers somewhere else, and he fell asleep. And it just so happened that he went and rested in the very cave where David and his general Abishai were hiding. And as Saul was lying there, totally vulnerable, David came and stood over him and drew his sword out, and Abishai said to David, "What a wonderful victory this is! God has delivered your enemy to you." And here was David standing over Saul with his sword. Here was the man who had tried to kill him 7 times. Saul was the only thing in between David and his rightful arising to become the king of Israel. And Abishai said, "The Lord has given him to you, David. You may kill him now." And David raised up his sword and brought it down and did what he had to do. He and Abishai then left the cave, rejoined David's 600 soldiers on the other side of the valley, and then while they were camping there, just about an hour later, Saul comes out of the cave, surrounded by his army of 3,000, and you say, "Well, wait a minute, didn't David kill Saul?" Well, no, he didn't. This is what happened in the cave. David stood over Saul with his sword drawn, ready to kill him. The man who had tried 7 times to murder him, the man who had kept him from becoming the king, was now delivered to him, and he lifted up the sword. But all of a sudden, something happened. And this is the key and the center of this story. Then came the river. Then came the healing water that was to mark and change David's life forever. You see, the spring that David found was not really En-gedi in the middle of the desert. The spring that came to David directly from God was mercy and forgiveness. And as he stood over Saul, he said to himself, "I cannot kill Saul no matter what he has done. I forgive him." And that's the river. That's David's secret river, the river of healing and mercy and forgiveness. And that's the river to which I want all of you to come and kneel by